two options. One of them was we set up the security on the Elliott database through pSQL so that we can allow people to access it with read only,
Right.
which is what we want to do. Unfortunately, right now, basically all we can kind of do is give people access to the server, and then they have carte blanche. They can do whatever they want and make mistakes on there, which is what we're
Right.
trying to avoid. The other one was setting up a backup and then having people um, utilize that backup. So it's not like read only. It's almost like read only, right? They're just looking at the copy,
Right.
which I think, was fine because that's less risk. But the only problem is, from our understanding, it's the PSQL that looks at a flat file database, right? Like flat files, and it doesn't work without that connection. So if we replicated the pSQL database and then give someone access to that, would the pointers still work for them to actually be able to see that? And Zach, correct me if I'm wrong in that sort of questioning.
All
I
right.
guess
Uh,
would be
uh,
real time data too at that point.
let me address your question in a few different ways. Okay. So, well, this is let me share my desktop. Okay, and
Yeah.
then you can see what I'm doing. Okay, and this is one of the customer that I have a closer support relationship with. Okay, this customer. Oh well, yeah, change password. This is a customer that they have close to 200 Elliott user.
Hmm.
It's a big site, okay? And this is what they do. And so if I may bring up the PC Control Center, and and you will see that they have this server and they have this server. And the this server is the database engine, okay, for pSQL. This server is where they store the backup database. Now, you don't have to have a separate server for the backup database. You could use the same server for backup database. And but just so you know that if you bring up Elliott, right? Okay. I presume you're familiar with the Elliott interface, right?
A little bit. We got
Okay.
brought in here as a third party MSP from the
Okay. Oh,
purchasing
okay.
company. So
So so so in this way, right? Now this is the Elliott database. Okay. Well, this is basically the multiple company. Okay. Davidson is the live production database. This database we call company 50 is the data they copy overnight. Every night they just make a copy and copy to company 50. So far, do you follow?
yep.
Now, the purpose of doing that is they have new salesperson coming, and then they don't know if the salesperson can do the job, and then whether they will mess up or not, right? So they copy the data from last night over to 50, and then so if they want to train the new salesperson, they said, well, you can go to company 50, you can play with it, and then whatever you do, it doesn't matter. That's the idea behind that, right? Now, in terms of uh, this database, right, is actually reside on a different server, which is reside on this what I call the DAV Fires One server, and then but it can reside on the same server. It doesn't matter. Okay, so if you want to access the company 50, and then you just basically expand it, okay, and then on this server, and you see that there is this 50 database, well, they have a multiple, different copy for different purpose, okay? And then this is the common one they will use, okay? But no, actually this is it's likely that they will be using this one, but but they are more than that, okay? And then you also see they have a company 99, right? That's actually a testing database. And and then they have a website accessing the data they want to mess around with it, etc., and then see how the website works. So usually when they develop a website, they running against the company 99. And this is the last night data. And then this is today's data. So in theory, what you can do is you can just basically copy the database from the live company to a training company every night. And then you just let your user access that data from last night. If they access that data from last night and whatever they do, even if they want to update or whatever, it doesn't matter because those are not your live database. Does that make sense to you?
That
This
does make sense.
so with this is kind of what Mark showed me, except what Mark showed me the other day is we created a separate testing training site like you have with the 50 Davidson.
Right,
And we named
correct.
it like 99, whatever we named it, 99, the
Right,
same company
right,
name. But
right. So,
it
right.
didn't create another database at that point. He just showed me where you had to copy flat files. So are you
Yeah,
saying that you don't need the flat files when you actually have the copy of the database then?
you copy those files from
So
one
we're
data
still
folder
making
to the other data folder. This
so
is
we're,
data 50 folder. This is data folder. So you just basically copy those files from one folder to the other folder. Just so you know that it's not a flat file because the flat file is usually meaning it's an XG file. You can bring up the like a notepad, right? It is not like that. Those files are index file and then it's a database file. So just because they are individual data file, they are not flat file.
so
And
then in that case, I guess our question is so that the developers with the Power BI, they want to be able to have access to that database. But when we did the copying of the files, it didn't create another database, essentially, is what our concern was.
it's not creating it's basically copy from one folder to the other folder. Okay. And then and then you just double your disk space requirement, right? But disk space today is inexpensive, so you double your disk space, okay? And then you have one data folder, you have another data folder, whatever, say data folder 50, and then to store the same data as a data folder as of last night. Disk space is not really an issue nowadays. So you just copy over, then you let the user using the database pointing to the data 50. They can do whatever they want, even if they want to update, it's not an issue.
Yeah, that makes sense. I get where you're coming from. What we are actually giving these people access to would be the SQL backend. So not inside Elliott. They're not going to be accessing it from there
Right,
because they're developers and they want to get tables and stuff so they can integrate it into
right.
their tables and everything. So does that make sense, Zach?
No, that's what my question is. So when we copied the files the other day with Mark on the phone, I created that and I can share my screen and I can reduplicate it now if we want to replicate it. But I
Oh, well,
copied
okay.
those files. It did, if you open up Elliott, it shows me a 99 company name test in theory. But in the back end, where you're inside the P-SQL control center itself, there is not a database there, and that's what the Power
Ah,
BI developers need.
all
So
right.
that's where I'm missing
So,
where how does it create that database for us?
so what happened is we need to create that database.
Okay.
And then that's something we can do for you as long as you say you have a data 99, then we can create a data 99 for you. And then we can name it. Okay. We have certain naming convention. Okay. And then
Mhm.
so I would suggest you follow our naming convention. And then so this is the things we would like to do if possible. So what you would do is you can right click here and say you want to create a new database, right? And then when
Mhm.
you create a new database, and then you need to basically specify two things. The one of the things you need to specify is the where is your DDF? And then DDF is basically the schema of the database. And then the other thing is you need to specify where does the data file reside. You need to specify this too. Once this two is specified, and then we create a database from there, user can access that database. Right now,
That
the
that
database
answers
has
the
not been
question.
created yet. That's
That's
really
good.
all it is. Okay, it's not difficult.
Okay. So just create it new, and then what would be the process? Is it something we can speak with Merck again? And if you pass it on to him,
You
have
can
him
either
show
speak
us?
to Mark or you can speak to Roger. And then I think the key is I would prefer you guys don't create a database yourself
Okay.
because there's a naming convention we like you to follow. So speak to us and then don't create it yourself. That's all we ask.
Okay. Yeah, that'd be perfect if we get something lined up, I guess, because I'd like to go through it and then figure out the copy.
Actually, Roger, you can help, right? Roger, can you help to create a database?
Oh, yes. Yes.
Okay. Did you say the 99? Data 99?
No, I deleted it because when we talked to Gunjan and Gary last week, they said that they didn't want it inside of Elliott. So I purged what was there, the copy of the data.
Uh-huh.
But
So
with that, it's like it gets back to the copying. So we have the database. If we have the copying function that's in there, I'm assuming you'd set that up too with the database. And then once those files are copied over, it's not something where we have to do a copy of the what did he say? Mark told me last week was like all the BTR files. So once they're there in that folder, the database handles from database copy to database copy overnight.
yeah, there is a few DAT file, okay, and then but well, it's complicated. If you're in the A6 and then you can eliminate the DAT file. I don't know, are you using Elliott A6 or A5 right now?
I believe it's five.
A5,
A,
yeah, it's
Yeah.
A5.
A5.
So
A5.
in Elliott A5, you will still have some DAT file, but those DAT file is not you access on the relation engine level, but it is needed for Elliott. Okay. So typically when, like say, for example, a company like Davidson, right? When they do a copy from 50, okay, or to 99, they will copy both the DAT file as well as the BTR file. And then also when you copy, right? If you have a user in the system and then open up those table, some of the BTR file may not be copied. So the copy timing is also important. You should do it at nighttime. Typically, I just schedule it. I know there's no user in the system, then we schedule the time to do the copy automatically by using scheduled task to do it. And then so, but now, Zach, do I understand you correctly? You guys don't want to create another data folder because you say people don't like it? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think at this point the concern is the back end team just wants to be able to pull data from the live database, but I don't think they want a separate inside of Elliott showing as a separate in there. So that's
You can actually eliminate it. Okay, for example, in Elliott, you can just basically in Elliott you can set up number one security to make sure user only have access to certain company. That's one way. Or on the user interface level, you can hide certain company. Okay, and then so there's a very different way you can make sure that user don't see that company.
yeah, when Mark was looking at it, he said we'd have to break all the existing because it was set, everybody was set up as like almost like an admin root level. So we'd have to go back to all the users and we'd have to recreate the permissions from what Mark was telling me. That's why I was showing underneath everybody's account essentially.
Well, I think we can talk about how to, address that issue properly, okay? And then you know, the other thing is you can just have a different server, and then that way it's easier to hide it if you have a different server. And so there's
Yeah,
a
I
different,
think
one very different strategy you can use, I think. We can talk about that.
okay.
Now, as far as like for my customer, right? And and then they said, oh, having another copy of the data, and then they know this data is not real, and then they can go in there and play with it. It is actually very valuable because if you want to do something in Elliott, you say, I am not sure what is the impact with this. Let me try in my testing company to do it, etc. Right? I mean, that itself is a huge advantage. So I'm not sure whether the argument say don't see the other company is maybe they have certain concern, but I do see there's a big advantage of having a testing database so everybody can play with it without messing up the live data.
Okay. Yeah, so right now I did restore the data underscore 99 that we created.
Uh-huh.
I could share my screen again if you wanted to see what we
Sure.
have
Okay,
at
let
least
me
at
let
this
me
point.
start sharing. Okay.
Okay, let me log into that account for Elliott here. And then at least you can see where Mark took me to the day when we were at the certain portions with it. So supervisor account. All right, and I will share it here. Let me go sharing. All right, so from here, I'll get the password. And I just restored the one that we did from last week. So this is basically where we got to. So kind of like what I was describing is like when we copy the flat file.
But
There,
this is not showing up right. Okay, I can show you how to do it. Okay.
okay.
Uh, can you can you do this for me? Okay. Right click on Eli A5 data. PC right click, yes, and choose property. Okay. And then go to directory. And then copy that directory location.
Yeah.
Okay, right, copy. Okay, and make sure is copy. Okay, now, uh, I want you to uh, right, good. Okay, can you navigate to that folder for me, please? And I like to have you create a subfolder. Uh, that's called this 3PDDF. DDF, 2D.
You sound like I'm having troubles hearing you really far away right now.
I'm saying it's a 3PDDF, 2D.
BDF?
No, DD.
DDF. Okay.
Yeah, good. Okay. Hit enter. Okay. Now, copy all the DDF file in this current folder. Right. To this 3D DDF. Yeah, let's check. Oh, excellent. Okay. So go back to your PC Code Control Center. Okay. I want you to exit out of that user interface. Right. Exit. Okay. Right click on database and do a new database. And the name of this database is called E3P A5. No, A5, number 8.
85. Okay.
Yeah, A5 and data 99. Okay, go to the location. Go to the location field. Yeah, okay, good. Uh, that's the no, actually, hold on. Don't copy. Didn't you having in the notepad you have a copy of that field?
Oh, yep.
Yeah, copy that field. Okay, and paste it. And then do a backslash and 3PDDF. Good. Okay. The two checkbox under the database option, uncheck it. Okay, and click finish. Okay, now this is not done. Okay, right click on E3P A5 data 99 and go to property. And then click on the database direction, that line. Okay, click on that line, click remove, and then do a new and do a paste, whatever you have in the value. Okay, backspace to all the way to erase the bin A5 and type data underscore 99 and click OK and apply and say OK. All right, now you can expand the E3P A5 data 99. You can access the table.
Okay,
This is basically the database from data 99, just so you know.
awesome.
You're done.
That's perfect. So then with that, then you're saying then we just create the job essentially that would create a copy at night with a scheduled task?
Right. So the main issue I want to mention is this, okay? If you have all the user using the Elliott and then open the file, those files may not be copied successful. Is there a way to bypass that? Yeah, there's a way, but it just basically increase the complexity, right? So the easiest thing is you select a time that you know nobody is using the data, nobody is using the data 99, and then you copy those files, and then yeah, then everything will be easier.
Do you know, Evan, do they use that around the clock then, or is this something?
They close at 4 o'clock,
Okay.
so they're
So
pretty much
what
done after that.
So
so
worst case scenario, we'd have to do something like if somebody left a computer open with Elliott open, would
yeah,
worst case scenario be we'd have to schedule maybe like a restart of this server before
can
we
I can
can
I
schedule task?
can I also show you something? Okay.
Yeah.
Go back to the PSQL Control Center and then go to Tools. There's something called Monitor. Choose that. Monitor. Okay, and accept. And go to Active File. And you see right now there's a whole bunch of data file being open, right?
Yeah,
If you go ahead, copy the file, it's likely all this open file will not be copied. So
makes sense.
that's something you should be aware of.
Yeah, so then I almost wonder if we have to create maybe a scheduled task just to reboot the server nightly or something right before that copy runs essentially to shut everybody's connection down. Because it essentially, I'm assuming, disconnect the person and Elliot, even though it's still logged in on the computer side. Once it comes back up, it's not going to auto log in.
I think that's a good idea. We'd have to definitely run that by Eric first, just to verify that we'd be able to balance it every night.
And just make sure that nobody's sitting there with Elliot open on their machine. They lock their computer for the night, and which we know users do all the time. So
Yeah, exactly. And
so then at this point, I guess with the data itself, so being that we have the database there, we do the scheduled task, and then you're saying in theory it will copy it will copy that data 99. So everything that's at the root level of this folder data instantly comes into here then? Or is that
Right.
the scheduled task with the
Yeah,
database?
correct.
So the
Just
database copy essentially does the same thing from the database side inside the control center to mimic the files, these BTR files and DAT files.
yeah, you copy the DAT and the BTR, but the control center only allow you to access the BTR.
So you're saying it would be a copy of the database and a copy of both these files, or the data file to the data 99? Is
The
this,
copy of a file is copy of the database. There's no separate copy of the database.
okay, so we're not backing a database up or replicating it. It's just these files. We'd have a PowerShell script essentially would say copy data to data 99.
Correct.
Okay, that makes sense now. Because the pointer's back on the back end of the database that points to these files anyways, is what we pointed to. That makes sense now. Okay. Awesome. So yeah, I guess if you guys do have, if Roger, if you do have anything, the only discrepancy I think that we'd have to bring to the rest of the staff is, are they going to care if this is here?
Okay, can we also look at one thing? Okay, I like to check another matter. Okay, which is related to the security. Okay, can we go
Mhm.
to your data folder? I mean, go to navigate to right click on the data and then choose property and go to security. Okay, so you see that everyone can read and execute this folder, data, right? But people doesn't really have a modified right to this folder. How about right? And then so my question is whether did you replicate this security identically on the data 99?
It
If it's
might be from the root level,
then
I
I don't
guess.
think there's a lot of issue.
Yeah, it's from the root level, so it should
Okay,
come.
so you inherited. Okay, now I think you're okay.
Yep, it's identical. Perfect. Yeah. So then I guess at this point, did you want to look and see what Mark was showing me the other day? Because he said that like the users, he's like, we're gonna have to recreate every single user to get it hidden. Because I did ask
Uh,
that. I'm like,
I think I know what he's talking about. Okay, and then it's okay. Yeah, I think I know what he's talking about. And then basically, if you want to expand the company O1 for me, please. Okay, and then go to the system file and go to password setup and then go to change. Bring up any user.
I think we'll just do the sys or SB.
Okay, now you are specified. I think you are defined that for company 0. Am I right to say that? Hit enter. Yeah, okay. When you're defining a user, right? You can define that user at the company level, or you can define it at the all company level.
Mhm.
Right now, you basically say this particular user, they can access all company. So then therefore, it doesn't matter company 1 or company 99, they can all access it. So now, if you want to limit this user to access company 1 only, what do? Right? So then you will, I think the proper way to do it is you do a copy of this user from all company to company 1.
Yeah.
That's the proper way to do it. And then after you copy to the company 1, then you delete the all company record. Does that do I make sense
Yeah,
for
that's
myself?
kind of what I was saying, and I didn't want to have to recreate. I think it was like 50 or 60 people.
Yeah, I
So
know.
I
So
don't know.
that's the price you have to pay, right? I mean, so if
Yeah,
you want to restrict the security so nobody can access the company line, then that's what you have to do in the Elliott. There's another thing you can do, just basically hide it from the user interface. Okay, go back to your Elliott control center for me, please. Okay. Now, on the individual user level, you can right click on the Elliott Business Software node. Okay, and then you can say hi company. And then you can just hide the 99 and you say, okay,
yeah. I think we might have to do that at this point
yeah,
because
okay. Well, I think,
we're not gonna recreate all those, Evan. I don't know.
yeah.
That's
So,
For
so
sure
I'm
not.
saying that this is the option you can consider, and then, but obviously that's up to you, right?
right.
And, the other possibility is you can make 99 to a different server. Then, then your user is not going to see 99.
Okay.
Hey, can I
Yeah, I
jump
think
in real quick, guys? This is Eric. I'm sorry I joined late.
Eric,
So are we talking about setting up a test company?
yes,
Basically, yeah.
we
Yeah,
created a
99
brand
is
new
a,
database at this point. So for the back end for Gungeon and Gary to get to the database, we have it now at this point. So it's set up. So we have it in theory. We just have to create a scheduled task. From what Edward was saying, we'll create, work with Roger and create a scheduled task that runs nightly to copy the files from data to data 99. And now that we have this database, this is where the confusion was last Friday, is Mark only showed me the option to just copy the data files, which showed. But now from what Edward showed us, we at least have a database now that I guess hopefully is going to be readable from a, well, I guess that brings up another question, Edward. So if they're using it, if they're using or want to query this database itself using Power BI, and those are flat files, isn't this still technically a flat file and not like a database?
It is the database.
Yeah, I think that's where we're gonna have to go back to Gary then again, Evan, at this point and find out how, because they were saying they want to read it inside a SQL, and the only thing that I could do, that I came up was using like an ODBC connector.
Yeah, they need to connect
Right. Okay.
ODBC to
So,
that database.
Zach, can I show you something? Okay.
Yeah.
So expand the E3P A5 data 99 for me. Okay. And then find ARCUS FIL.
Said it was
ARCUS FIL.
ARCS.
CUS. That's a Charlie Universe. Yeah, that's right. That's it. ARCUS FIL. Double click on it. Okay. Now, this is your customer record, right? So now put a semicolon at the end of this the first statement. Okay. Okay. Now, yes. Okay. Press enter to the next line. Okay. You can say select star. Well, put a space there. Okay. Star from. Do a space from. ARCUS FIL. No need for code, just ARCUS FIL. CUS.
ARCUS.
FIL. Space. Space. Where? WHERE. Space. Cus underscore name. Space. Like. Space. Single quote. MSC uppercase. Uppercase MSC. Percent sign. End quote.
I didn't catch that. Your mic's going in and out. I'm having trouble hearing you.
Do a end quote. End quote. Another single quote. Yes. Okay, good. Now click on the toolbar, right? The third one to the right side. From the right. The third one from the right. Yeah, click on that guy. Okay. You tell me this is a flat file. Are you saying this is a flat file?
No, this is acting like a database, but the
Yeah.
question is the representative that's wanting to pull with Power BI wants to use SQL, not P-SQL.
Right. So there is a misnomer that you guys think this is a flat file. This is not a flat file. This is a database.
But I guess it doesn't answer our question about the SQL portion of it. Like I found a way around with ODBC. I have it on a test machine of ours. Let me just bring that up too, and we can look at it. To find it here, SB test. Log into that machine at timed out here, so I'll bring this one up. Go into sharing. Go back and share the other screen. All right, so this is the test machine that I was playing around the other night too. So I ended up having to do a full version of SQL Express, essentially 2019. And then I put a SQL Management Studio on it. And then from here, this is kind of how I got around doing the ODBC connector to it. But I don't know if this is going to be sufficient for them to run. I don't know how Power BI is going to query it because it's a linked server, which I don't see how I don't see how they're going to be able to pull data off of a linked server because it's just pulling it. It's essentially a connection, but we'll see once it comes up here and see what your guys' thoughts are on it. Machine's not the fastest either, so there we go, connect. So underneath here, we have the server objects, linked servers. So basically, we have a live connection to the database. So it's not, I have all the same functionality here. So I guess, Eric, do you know, is this something with Gary? Is this something that he'd be able to function?
So let me see, if you go into the AR customer file again that you were playing with before, can we see data in it?
AR, this one, no,
US,
ARC.
ARCUSFIL. So if we click that, does it expand or anything like that?
I think you'd just be able to execute commands on it, if anything. Maybe not. You can't even execute commands. So all you have is the option, like do a custom report, I guess. I don't know. But I'm not a SQL administrator, so I don't know if this is something where you could pull off of, but at least this is kind of what I was playing with last night to see if I could get something where you guys could access it inside a SQL Management Studio. But otherwise, the only other option would be that I think of is we dump the P-SQL client installer on the people's machines that need it. And then with what Gary just showed us, this is, it's essentially the same functionality of what SQL Server Management Studio would be. It's just a different interface that they'd have to learn, but versus doing it actually from a direct, database itself, like what we're familiar with working on databases. Like if you come here and you're able to basically see tables. Because correct me if I'm wrong, Edward, there's no way that you'd be able to convert a P-SQL database over to a SQL database from what you told us in our email yesterday. Like it'd be a different.
Well, you can replicate it. People do that all the time. You replicate your P-SQL data to SQL data, usually on a schedule basis, like a nightly basis, right? I have customers do that all the time, and then they do their operation against the SQL database, not a P-SQL database.
Yeah.
And then this is very common practice.
How do you do that, Edward?
Microsoft SQL has those kind of a utility.
Okay.
I think in the past, I think it's called DST, something like that, Data Service Transform. Okay, I don't know what is the current name right now. And this is common things people do. Unfortunately, I'm not an expert in that, but I know this is definitely doable. I suspect if you just go to the AI and then ask the question and then say, how do I replicate data from P-SQL to MS SQL, they will give you the answer. But I'm not involved in the detail for that. But I know this is definitely doable.
Yeah, like I researched last night on it when we were looking at this, like when I was doing this step here, and everything was saying like you need a third party utility to do it from what I was seeing. But if you're saying like DTS, if there is a program, the Microsoft
Something like a DST. Okay. You know what? I'm going to look at the AI right now. Okay. And I think this is this cannot be that complicated. Okay. Now, so I'm gonna ask ChatGPT, okay, if I want to replicate P-SQL database to to MS SQL. I remember this 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 tool called DST database, DTS, database, database DTS, database, or database transform service, transform services. Can you elaborate? Okay, I'm gonna share my screen. Okay, Zach, and share your screen so I can share my screen. Okay. Uh, so here's the question I asked, right? Yes, you're remembering correctly. DTS, Data Transforming Service, was Microsoft original ETL tool for SQL using older version, etc. DTL is legacy. And well, you think that it's Postgres sequence. It's not Postgres sequence, but it doesn't matter. Okay. So by many SQL's integration service, which is named the standard ETL replication tool. Okay. And then so if you are on the modern SQL Server, you should use the SSIS. That's it.
Yeah.
Sounds good, Eric. I know you're probably not the right person to ask, but you guys have a data team. That's obviously Gary and Gunjan. Can we give them these instructions? And we can help them run through this SSIS process. I mean, really, TriStar's data team might want to be the ones who handle this anyway. But I'll message Jeremy and Jasmine about it and say, hey, this is what would need to happen to get it into that correct framework.
Yeah, I think they might, depending on how this works and where it runs, they might just need help from you guys if they need a VM or if they need, rights to something, and maybe just some oversight to make sure that they're not being too fast and loose with our database. But once we get this set up, this looks like it would allow us to create a Microsoft SQL compatible copy and schedule this for like a daily, run or an overnight run, so we could keep it relatively up to date. Is that kind of what you're thinking, Evan?
Yeah, it looks like you just need the PostScript SQL client essentially because you're doing it via ODBC again.
Well, we can't do it through PostScripts because.
Well, no, it's the client because it's the ODBC connector that's saying inside. So look at checkmark 1, connect via PostScript SQL via ODBC. So you'd have to have the client. So it's doing the same thing like what we just did on the SQL Management Studio. But this is different steps essentially where it's saying you insert the SQL Server, and then from there, there's a SQL Server agent scheduled job. So it's a different facet. It's not SQL Server Management Studio. You'd still have to probably do a full-blown SQL Express install at that point, along with the SQL Server integration service. So it's probably part of the install of SQL Server Express. There might be a checkbox or something that says check the box to install it. Yeah, either way, it's gonna have to be another server because I doubt we're gonna want to run it on the same server
Right.
as Elliott at that point.
We would appreciate not.
Mhm. Yeah, I guess with that, we'll see what we can do. We'll research it at that point. But then when we're on our side, like your portion, Edward, on the connectivity side of it, like what are the connectivity options for it to connect? Is it as simple as seeing it like what we just saw with the ODBC?
Yeah, that's ADO.NET. I prefer you use ADO.NET. It has a faster performance.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's just gonna it's gonna have to be something we'll build the server at that point, as long as it gets approved and just decide where we want to place it and then build a one and then like what Evan said, give the people that are SQL database managers at that point that are fluent in it, we'll give them the server access that they need and then let them set it up and configure it. And then we're there to assist as needed for permissions, I think, is the route to go. So
Sounds like a plan. Thanks for all your help, Edward.
Hey,
Very
no problem.
insightful.
I'm very glad that I can be helpful today.
Appreciate it, Edward. Thank you.
Okay,
Nice to
take care,
talk to
guy.
you, Edward. Nice to talk to you, Roger.
Okay,
Okay, thank you.
bye-bye.
Take
Yeah,
care.
thank you. Thank you, guys.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Take care. Bye.